Good morning, everyone, and thank you for joining us today. I'd like to start by acknowledging that I'm speaking to you from the city of Vernon, which is on the unceded territory of the Silks Okanagan people, the original inhabitants of this land. My name is Marta Green, and I'll be the facilitator for this three-part webinar series. I'm a senior hydrogeologist in the BC and Yukon Division here at Associated, and I specialize in water supply development and protection. In that role, I have the pleasure to support many governments, be that local, provincial, or First Nation, with their groundwater development and management project needs. So I hope everyone's doing well during these COVID times. And for me and my family, we've been enjoying this great pause on our local trails and getting to our neighbors. And we've been doing lots of gardening, and we have 4 new additions to the family in the form of backyard egg-laying chickens, but they're 18 weeks old and they haven't laid any eggs yet. So if you have any tips, let me know. So we are pleased to be presenting our very first webinar series, this one focusing on getting projects to shovel ready. The first session will be with Heather Taylor today on the very specific regulations and permits required for construction around water, and I'll be introducing her shortly. For session 2, next Thursday, June 18th at the same time, Carrie Nadeau will be talking about some treatments you can make instead of your typical riprap or concrete reservoirs for streamside erosion control and water management. These techniques include bioengineering or living walls and constructed wetlands. So pretty cool stuff coming up next week. And last but not least will be Drew Layback, senior hydrologist. The first 2 sessions were more locally focused around a construction site around water, but for those involved in longer term planning and you have a bit more time to plan your project, perhaps you have a water withdrawal or the province has asked for an environmental flow needs assessment as part of your license application, Drew will shed some light on the mystic world of EFNs. All right, so without further ado, let me introduce the very talented Heather Taylor. Heather is an aquatic biologist and Associated's BC regulatory specialist, hence the widely used term Ask Heather. She is an accomplished project manager, leading and delivering multidisciplinary projects on time and on budget for municipal and provincial government clients. In addition to managing these projects, her role is to focus on environmental permitting for small and large-scale developments, fish, amphibian, and reptile sampling, salvage and habitat assessments, and bird surveys. Heather is on the Bishop Wild Bird Foundation Board of Directors and is an avid mountain biker and trail runner, hobbies that fulfill her love of nature of all things furry, feathered, and finned. So I know she saved the day for me, both on the regulatory front and on the trail, moving snakes off bike paths like the pro that she is. So thank you for joining us today, Heather.
Thanks, Marta, and thank you for everybody who is attending. Like Marta said, this presentation will talk about federal regulations. We will touch on some provincial regulations specific to here in BC, but we will definitely try to answer questions for Alberta regulators or from Alberta attendees. Similar regulations, just slightly different in the way that they're outlined and different names of acts and regulations. So we'll talk about those. So let's get started here. The outline of today's presentation, we're going to look at when the regulations apply. So we're talking specifically about construction in or around water. We'll talk about regulatory updates from DFO and also the Riparian Areas Protection Regulation, which is a BC provincial regulation. We will touch on the Water Sustainability Act. So that is a provincial regulation here in BC. Attendees from the other provinces, and I think we might have an attendee from Saskatchewan as well. So attendees from the other provinces, you'll have similar regulations, just slight differences. So we'll talk about those at the end. And then we'll talk about some other updates. There's updates to the Navigable Waters Act, the Impact Assessment Act. Those are both federal. Also, again, provincial updates to the Agricultural Land Reserve. So regulations here in BC, again, just touch briefly on those. And then we'll talk about some questions. So when do these regulations apply? These regulations apply for any project in or around water. So any projects, even if it's above the high water mark, there is potential that even the Water Sustainability Act will apply, that DFO regs might apply. Anything that might impact the stream, impact the bank of the stream, these regulations will apply. So it's not just work for water projects below the high water mark. So what does this mean for your projects, for projects that you're working on? It means really that project planning is important. You need to think about how long it's going to take to get the permits, what the work windows are for the projects, and work windows can include not just in-stream work windows, work for specific to fish, but amphibians, birds, often a lot of projects, and you can see from the slide here that this is actually for the Red Deer River in Alberta, a list of timing windows for construction work. So you may have to phase projects even to clear outside of the bird window and then do the in-stream work later in the summer when the birds are active, but the fish are not migrating. They don't have any eggs in the stream. There's no delicate life stages, no fry, etc. So project planning is definitely the most important component here. So let's talk about what is a stream, what the definition of a stream. So this definition comes from the Water Sustainability Act, and it defines a stream as a natural watercourse, including a glacier course, water body, whether the stream channel has been modified or not. I'm going to talk about that for 1 second here. That means, and we see this in a lot of municipalities where streams have been rerouted historically and flow through a ditch and then continue down in the stream course further downstream. That section of ditch that the city has built, that the municipality may have built, that's actually considered a stream. It conveys the original stream course. And so these acts apply to that stream, that ditch line. Part B of this definition is a natural source of water supply. So without limitation, a lake, pond, river, creek, spring, ravine, gulch, wetland, or glacier, whether or not it usually includes water. That's another consideration a lot of people miss, particularly for those who are attending from the Okanagan. We have a lot of these big ravines on the hillside. They're ephemeral. They only drain water for sometimes even a couple of weeks of the year, but they are still considered streams, and the regulatory conditions still apply. So still need to do applications to do work in and about those ravines. So for the Fisheries Act, the definition is a little bit different. The Fisheries Act applies to any fish-bearing watercourse, so any watercourse that either contains fish or could contain fish. So as long as there's no known fish barriers, and by fish barriers, I mean natural fish barriers, not necessarily man-made fish barriers. If there's no known fish barriers, then the Fisheries Act does apply. And then for the riparian area protection regulations, and those in BC, the riparian areas protection regulation is the new act. It replaces the riparian areas regulation. So RAR and RAPR are the same thing, basically, for those of you who are wondering. So the riparian areas protection regulation applies within 30 meters of any watercourse that supports fish. That one has a specific special caveat too. When we say supports fish, it doesn't necessarily just mean fish bearing. It means that it drains into a fish bearing. So the analogy that I like to use, somebody told me this years ago, was that if you dumped a quart of oil into the stream, would that quart of oil eventually reach a fish bearing stream? Even if it ran subsurface, if it ran underground for a ways, if it would end up in a fish bearing stream, then the RAPR regulations apply. And this photo here is an interesting one. This is actually a wetland, even though it's man-made, it's defined as a wetland. Was a development probably 80 years ago in a local community here in the Okanagan, where they filled in the wetland adjacent to the lake to build a community, which we have seen quite regularly in the past. And they decided to keep this little sort of man-made feature that it would be nice for the property owners to back onto this little lagoon. And so this lagoon is actually defined as a wetland under the Water Sustainability Act. So all of the regulations there within apply. And this little lagoon is also attached to Kalamalka Lake, so it also applies. The Fisheries Act also applies. There are fish in this lagoon, so the Fisheries Act also applies, as well as the riparian area protection regulations. So let's talk about some regulatory changes first here. There have been 3 federal environmental bills that were passed in August of last year. So the Fisheries Act, the Impact Assessment and Navigable Waters Act, and the Oil Tanker Moratorium Act. Other changes in 2019, like I mentioned, the Riparian Areas Protection Regulation, which is formerly the Riparian Areas Regulation. That was updated in November 2019. So the Fisheries Act, some of the key changes to the Fisheries Act include a return to HAD. For those that don't know, HAD is harmful alteration, disruption, or destruction of fish habitat. So that's one of the big changes, HAD's back. There's also increased definition of fish. So fish are all fish species under the new Fisheries Act, the current Fisheries Act. The previous version, they had removed fish species and had reduced sort of protection around fish species that weren't defined as commercial or recreationally important. So now all fish species are protected. Other updates to the Fisheries Act, so they've developed codes of practice and standards. So far, there are only 2 available. There's a end of pipe fish screening and dredging available, but the intention is that the federal government will add these codes of practices with the intention that if you're following these codes of practices, you might not need an authorization or a request for project review from DFO. We also have designated project lists. Those are coming in. And so these are similar to the Impact Assessment Act, the SEA, which is formerly the SEA, the Canadian Environmental Assessment Act. Designated project list will be projects that will always require an authorization from DFO. So just take some of the guesswork out of it when you're planning a project. The last thing that I'm going to talk about for changes is the public registry. And so DFO is making an effort to be more transparent. So they'll have a public registry for all projects that come in so that you will be able to look up any projects that they're reviewing or authorizing to see what's going on there. So it's just really to deal with transparency within Fisheries and Oceans Canada. One thing I will just touch on is I think I'm noticing that DFO is becoming more litigious, more involved in sort of works that are being done that don't have proper authorizations or shouldn't have occurred. You know, we've seen a couple of local BC examples that have made pretty big media news coverage. One was some critical fish habitat was cleared along the Fraser River, and in that case, DFO ordered some corrective measures where the trees had been cleared. I think they have to replant the trees in that case. Also saw a lakefront development that destroyed some pretty critical fish habitat, and that one saw a 6-figure fine levied against the property owner and constructor for that project. So definitely seeing more news anyway about some of these failures to comply with Fisheries Act. So we're just going to talk briefly about the Riparian Areas Protection Act, so formerly RAR. This is a provincial regulation that is here in BC. And so the methodology for this hasn't changed. It's the same as what we were seeing previously under RAR. The methodology for the qualified environmental professional to actually conduct an assessment is the same. One of the changes, though, that is I think interesting and considerable is that previously under the old act, when a QEP, when a qualified environmental professional submitted an application, they would actually automatically be copied to the local municipality. So this regulation, for those that don't know, it's a provincial regulation, but it's triggered by the local government. So local government bylaws trigger this provincial regulation. In order to get your development permit, you have to submit this application to the province. And previously, it automatically got copied to the municipality. That's changed in this update, and the municipalities won't be seeing these applications anymore until the province signs off on them. That's interesting. It means that in cases, right or wrong, that we saw where the municipalities were making their own decisions and issuing their development permits, whether the province has signed off on the RAR application or not, that can actually no longer happen because the province won't send the municipality the application until they're happy with it, they're satisfied with it. It's my thought here that to counterbalance that that process there, that change, that they've made more measures for undue hardship, including areas of human disturbance. This is interesting to me, and I think that Vancouver Island, the Lower Mainland, Vancouver, I think they actually sort of deal with RAR applications probably a little bit better than we do in the Okanagan, not on purpose, but just because of historic development. And we do often see here in the Okanagan lakefront properties where the entire property falls within the setback, which is the no development area. So you basically have a sterilized lot if you don't develop within the setback. So I think these measures for undue hardship help address lots like that where the lot's been previously developed. The entire lot is within the setback, within the no develop zone, and the homeowner wants to rebuild their house or change something or add something on. So we'll see how that goes down the line. Now this regulation applies anytime there's work within 30 meters of a stream, and is also just for areas that actually adhere to RAR. So the municipalities and regional districts have to sort of adhere to RAR. And we see that mostly just in the south portion of the province. A lot of the northern regional districts and communities, regions don't actually follow RAR. And there is also Kelowna is another exemption. They actually have their own version of RAR that meets or exceeds the provincial regulations, so they actually don't adhere to RAR either. And this regulation, I should say also, so anything within 30 meters of a stream or a watercourse, this includes any disturbance. So construction, demolition, vegetation removal, even just a shovel in the ground soil disturbance, then this act is triggered. So it's something to think about if you're doing any work within this area. One other thing to touch on for this is that if you have a Water Sustainability Act application, then that actually usually supersedes any need for a RAR application. So if you're doing a Section 11 application under the Water Sustainability Act to do work in or about a stream, the province doesn't necessarily want to see a RAR application separate from that because the protections will be addressed often within the Water Sustainability Act. The only issue with that is that because RAR is administered through the local municipalities, the bylaw is still triggered and tripped. So we often have to do both a RAR application and a Water Sustainability Act application. And the other one is if you have a DFO authorization, that also negates the need for any RAR application. So let's just talk about the Water Sustainability Act for a second here. There have been no changes to the Water Sustainability Act recently. The last update was in 2016 when the current Water Sustainability Act came into effect. And so this is the BC regulations. So this act applies to any work in or about a stream. And they purposely leave that a little bit vague, like I touched on at the start. It means that if your project has the potential to impact the stream, even though the work may be above the high water mark, that this application still applies, that you still need to do an application under Section 11 of the Water Sustainability Act. And under Section 11, there are two types of applications. There's a notification. So a notification has to follow any authorized changes under Section 39.1 of the Water Sustainability Regulation. And so under Section 39.1, there's a list of projects that can go ahead under a notification. They include clear span bridges, culvert repairs or replacements, a few other works in there. The caveat there, and this is where I think a lot of people kind of miss, they get held up, is that under each of these types of authorized changes, there are conditions that need to be met. So For example, a culvert, you can do a culvert under a notification, but there are a list of conditions that that culvert has to meet. So the culvert has to be able to pass the 1 in 200 year flow. The culvert has to be buried at least, I think it's 1 meter underneath the road surface, and there are probably 6 or 7 other conditions. So often we have clients that are expecting something to go under a notification, and then we find out through the design phase that, say, maybe the culvert's not big enough to pass at a 1 in 200 year flow. That then actually triggers an approval application. And so approval is the second type of application, and it's for any projects that do not fall under section 39.1. And really, basically, any works below the high water mark where you might be altering the stream channel, you're going to need an approval application pretty much. The notification applications, basically, once they're processed, they go to an ecosystems biologist to look at, to consider any ecosystems conditions to make sure that you're not going to do any damage or harm to fish or fish habitat while you're constructing, whereas the approvals, they go to ecosystems. They also go to a water manager to look at the technical side of the work. So an engineer might review the project if it's a bridge project. Water officer will review it for hydrology and hydraulic considerations, etc. So just a few other federal regulatory updates here. I said the Impact Assessment Act has been updated, so that's formerly the Canadian Environmental Assessment Act. It's now the Impact Assessment Act, and it's similar to SIA, to the previous act. It applies to projects on the project list or through ministerial designation. One of the big key changes that was really important for the new Impact Assessment Act is that it requires mandatory early engagement with stakeholders, including Indigenous groups. So that was a big change from SIA 2012. The Oil Tanker Moratorium Act probably won't have an impact on too many people here. So I'll just say that it basically bans tankers in the North Pacific coast. So sort of north of Vancouver Island and up. I'm not sure about the specific areas, but I think it's from the north tip of Vancouver Island up to Alaska. There's an oil tanker moratorium. And then we have had, sorry, and it's not on the slide actually. Oh, it is on the slide. I just missed it. The Navigable Waters Act was also updated, and this has, similar to the Fisheries Act, has rolled back some of the changes that Harper made in 2012 to the regulation, and so regulated major works and obstructions on all navigable waters now, not just those scheduled. And navigable waters are any body of water used by a vessel for commercial or recreational purposes. Now the Navigable Waters Act now applies. Minor works under the Navigable Waters Act only need to meet criteria for navigable waters, so there's designated projects. Some of those include erosion protection works, docks, pipelines, outfalls, intakes, and dredging. So those have a list of designated works that can be done without a full application. And then provincial updates. There was also in 2019 an update to the Agricultural Land Reserve. Again, that's here specific to BC, and Agricultural Land Reserve are designated bodies, designated properties that are important to agricultural values. And so one of the key changes there is that the applications now are submitted by the municipalities instead of the property owners. And that just sort of make sure that the municipalities have some input and say and involvement in the application process. There are also limits to house sizes. Fill removal or placement now requires a notice of intent, so there are a few new triggers there as well. So just sort of to summarize why we're talking about this, really it's just to let you know that there are constantly legislative changes that we need to be paying attention to. And that doesn't mean that you guys need to be paying attention to them all the time, but definitely you want to seek out the advice of a trusted regulatory expert or a qualified environmental professional to make sure that what you are doing meets the proper criteria, and you have all the regulatory information that you need to plan the project and then the approvals to go ahead with that project. We are seeing that, environment is increasingly critical to project execution success. poor planning can definitely lead to project delays. It can lead to fines. So it's really important to start thinking about the environmental component of your project early on. We're also seeing media is actually we're getting more project attention, and social media is another consideration of that. And I'll just touch on a very brief example of that, where contractors were given the go-ahead to go in and create a laydown area before they started a project. And there was a miscommunication, and they went in and knocked down a bunch of fence to set up their laydown area, but that fence actually had bird boxes on it. And those bird boxes were occupied. And when the naturalist group that went out, that cared for those bird boxes, went out to check them, they were all down on the ground with unfortunately damaged chicks and eggs in them. And so that actually was a really big media sort of attention project that it received some local news coverage in the evening. So something to think about. Nothing, nobody wants to see, and it wasn't that the contractors intentionally did it. They didn't realize, and there was just a sort of a lack of communication there about what they could and couldn't do while setting up their laydown area. So really it's just about project planning. You just want to start early. You plan to have time for your fish windows, but also your bird windows, your wildlife windows. Like I said earlier, you may have to phase the project so that you're clearing outside of the bird window, but doing construction inside of the work window. And so that's it. Want to save time and project costs. Just think about project planning, and don't assume what worked on one project will work on another, because there's always regional differences. Species present may be different. Public and private lands have different regulations, and there's, again, the legislative changes. So that is it for the presentation side. We'll go to questions now.
Sure, yeah, and we also have, I think Dave might be having technical challenges. We also have Mel Pieretsky, our senior ecologist. She's also been diligently collecting your questions, and if she wants to unmute her mic, she can maybe take one from the chat room first.
Hi, right. It's Melanie. Hi, can you hear me?
Yeah, perfect.
Yeah, thanks, Mel.
Okay. Really, it was just one question from Jacqueline Howard. Are all streams treated equal under the WSA, whether it is fish bearing or not? Do you want to answer that one, Heather?
Sure, yeah. So for the most part, all streams are treated equally under the Water Sustainability Act. The ecosystems biologists are looking at fish in fish-bearing streams, so they are looking for that, but they're also looking for other wildlife sensitivities, so amphibians, reptiles, any critical habitat. So they are looking at other features besides fish-bearing or fish being in the stream. And then the water officers are looking at the other side of it. They're looking at the structure and the flow side. So those are also really important and critical while reviewing Water Sustainability Act applications. And Sean, as Marta mentioned, was kind enough to be here today. And Sean is with FLNRO on the South Coast. So Sean, I don't know if you have any comments on that question.
No, you covered it very well, Heather. Thank you.
Perfect, great.
One more question that just came in from Karen Devitt that kind of might relate. Can you comment on the applicability of the WSA to roadside ditches that are disconnected from a water course, but does convey ground and, I suppose, surface water?
Yeah, so if it's a municipal ditch that is not connected to a stream or a water course, then the Water Sustainability Act does not apply. If it conveys water from a stream, so like I said earlier, if it had been modified so that it actually carries stream water, then the Water Sustainability Act does apply. If it doesn't contain water specifically being conveyed from a stream, if it's just a ditch, it's acting as a ditch, the Water Sustainability Act doesn't apply. But just be aware that if you introduce deleterious materials into a stream, then there are, the Water Sustainability Act then applies to that. Fisheries Act also applies if there are fish in that stream. So you still want to, when you're working on ditches, make sure that you have the proper erosion and sediment control measures in place, especially if those ditches drain to stormwater or to a creek or a lake. But as far as doing construction work in the ditch itself, the Water Sustainability Act doesn't apply.
Yeah, and the question has a slight nuance. Thank you, Karen, for the question around conveying groundwater. So I would need to know more about if it's conveying groundwater, which direction is it going? Is it going to groundwater or is it coming from groundwater? But that is definitely if you have a well that is being used for the benefit of the citizens of BC, you need a water license or some sort of use approval. If it is just moving stormwater away and you are not using the water to some benefit, you do not need a license. And Sean, maybe you can touch on that. That is my understanding, if that helps, Karen.
Yeah, no, that's correct. One thing I would add with ditches, though, is that we are taking a closer look at these types of inquiries. Sometimes we'll be advised that there's no connectivity and that they're isolated. But what we're doing now is we're going back and looking at the historical data as well, and that could be air imagery, site visit, GIS data, and it could have been an unauthorized change in a stream recently, even going back maybe 10 years or so. And rather than allowing somebody just to fill that in or do construction without authorization, we may actually require an approval. Perhaps there, that lack of connectivity is creating a fish barrier or something like that. We might need to take a closer look. So it is a really tricky question when it comes to ditches because it's not a cut and dry answer. Also, some ditches do have connectivity downstream to fish-bearing water, so it might be a municipal drainage feature, but maybe 50 meters downstream, it provides nutrients and critical flows to sensitive habitat.
Thank you, Sean. And Karen, there's also the groundwater protection regulation. Any flowing well you must be able to shut off that flow or control that flow. So there is another regulation there if you want to kind of back up and see where is that flow coming from.
I was just say, sorry, just really quickly, just touching on that too. If you're in BC, the Riparian Areas regulation does apply to ditches. So there's a good chance that the riparian area regulations will also apply there.
Can we sneak in one more question?
Okay, and we've got 3 on here,
Okay.
3 questions. So whatever we don't answer, we'll send direct responses or post them. I'm just going to go through Mike Newell's, which came up next. When you mentioned RAR applies with any shovel in the ground project, does this include maintenance of existing disturbances, i.e. lawns, parking lots that were constructed in the 70s within the 30-meter setback of a fish or bearing stream?
Yes, so it does apply to existing projects and anything within 30 meters. So basically, if you're putting a shovel in the ground, then it does apply. If you're putting a shovel in the ground within 30 meters, it applies, that triggers the act. It doesn't mean that the setback is the full 30 meters because the setback can range from 5 to 30 meters. So it's important to contact a QEP and have them determine what that setback is and where and how it applies. Like I said, there are more allowances for disturbed human disturbances now under the new regulation. So I think we'll see more applications, more cases where we won't actually have to do too much under those applications, but the applications themselves still have to be submitted.
Thank you, Heather. If you want to just click to the next slide. Yeah, if we happened to miss your question, do please email me. The email address is there, and we will figure out how to answer it. A reminder about our next session with Carrie Nadeau next Thursday, June 18th at the same time. Carrie will be focusing on using some more sustainable techniques to manage your soil retention or water containment projects. Let us know of any other topics you would like us to feature perhaps in our next series, and any, again, any project-specific questions you can jot down there too. Some thank yous. Thank you to Heather, Dave, Audrey, Sean, and Mel for making this first webinar a success. And thank you to all of you for joining us and participating with your great questions. Of course, with COVID, the COVID period, and canceling all of my favorite conferences, made me really appreciate the people in our community. And so I'm feeling very connected. So thank you. And it gave me a chance to wear my Zoom suit. So thanks for that, and stay safe. And I hope to see you all again next time.
So Marta, I just want to say really quickly, we do know that there were some audience questions that were sent in to us. So Marta's email's up on the screen right now. Please email her your email address. We have answers to all of these questions, and we'll send the answers out to you. Just send her your email address, and we'll make sure that you get the answers that you need. And if you have any other follow-up questions, you can certainly let us know.
Bye.
Thanks, guys.